Some stories do not ask to be told aloud. They do not press their palms against the glass or rattle the doors of waking memory. They settle somewhere deeper, like dew into stone. And when they rise again, it is not with breath or voice, but with the hush of a place that feels colder than it should. Stories like this are not remembered because they are loud, but because they are quiet and still not forgotten. There was a village in the hills, far from the old roads, beyond where the market bells could be heard even in spring. Its name is mostly silenced now, half-chiseled from parish ledgers, overgrown on pilgrim maps. But a few still speak of it, not directly, not comfortably. They speak of signs. Withered violets left in threes. Salt poured in lines too straight for wind to lay. Butter that will not churn under a full moon. And the wind. Always the wind. They say she came with healing in her hands and left smoke in the air. But the truth was slower than that. Let us begin while it is night. Let us keep our voices low. Let the fire die gently. The tale will outlive both of us. She cured more than she killed. And they still lit the torches. The year they buried twice as many as they blessed was not the beginning, though that is where many begin. The spring rains had failed, and the rye was thin, but that was not uncommon. It was the breathless heat that came too early, curling the wheat heads too soon and baking the fleas into rugs and straw. That heat did not bake out again. Not at midsummer. Not at harvest. Not even in the gray smother of November. The air thickened instead, growing sour. The cattle hid from it. The children coughed in its presence and coughed again until quiet replaced them. When the carts began to roll in from Vaudreuil and St. Bonavin, carrying the stiffened dead wrapped in canvas, the steward of St. Bergrin declared the roads unfit for entrance. The gates were ordered sealed. But as with all things forgotten quickly, his voice faded when the carpenter's twins fell ill. And the guard who once swore to keep strangers out was the one who fetched her from the furrowed lane. She came with bare feet, worn soft as vellum, a basket on her arm, no larger than a baker's hush loaf, woven in 3 folds and bound with what looked like waxed gut string. Her hair was bound, though twisted as if done blind. She would not speak her name, but offered salt on her palm to the carpenter's wife, and when her brow furrowed in confusion, the stranger scattered it near the hearth and said only, "It'll draw the fever's mouth." The twins lived. Not strong, not loud, but they breathed, and that was more than could be said for the sexton's niece the week before. More than could be said for the midwife's own son. The villagers watched the twins grow, rabbit-limbed and blinking like those born 2 weeks too early, and said it might have been providence or might have been luck, but it had happened in her presence. And so she became a presence, a crease in the linen of St. Bergrin's days. She worked without coin, but asked for rind and pickled turnip and flatbread soaked in vinegar. She chewed willow bark, but never swallowed. She plucked daisies before rain and burned their stems with lichen. She never prayed aloud, just watched the sky closely and the sores more closely still. The children called her La Dame Sally, the salty lady. She smelled of sea brine and tang. Some nights, she waited beneath the yew trees at the edge of the burial tamaracks and pressed small parcels into the vicar's hand. Other nights, she was seen with her palms pressed to the damp of mausoleum stone. She slept somewhere no one ever named. Folk speak of one cure especially. The shepherd's girl, racked with the shaking plague, skin blackening from ankles up, lips blistered from her own breath. No priest would enter the hillside shanty where she lay, but the healer did. 2 days passed. On the 3rd, the girl came out, walking slow, touching everything like it might vanish. Her hair had gone white. The healer walked behind her, and the grass where she stepped remained green for another 3 weeks, though frost had already taken the wells. The village was grateful, but gravely so. A new silence spread, creeping like the illness hadn't. It was not just the survivors who stirred salt in their tea after that. A codex appeared in the hands of the old vicar, leafed late into the chill nights, a scorched birch tome black at its margins, pinned in a reverse slant that made the letters seem to dive from the page. Pages inside smelled faintly of pepper and soot, and bore drawings of liverwort and cowbane, roots peeled back into diagrams strange and fine. No name adorned the inner spine, but the pages turned impossibly, even with cold-numbed hands. She was never seen reading from it, but she knew what it contained. When the steward's own sister bore fever on her breath one Sunday morning, it was not from the church she sought salvation. It was the cabin at the edge, built not of village hands but dug into the knoll like a mouth, stone-lined and always shadowed. There, she was given a spoon of blackened liquid, light as vinegar on the tongue, but heavy in the gut. Her sweat broke 2 hours later, drawing a salt ring into the cot. She lived, and carried a child the next year. A pale one, but strong. Yet one man refused to bow to this pattern. He kept his prayer beads visible, lips always forming silent petitions. The priest, Father Aramond, seemed thinner with each cure. He began to sweat after lifting the host, and his wine spoiled more quickly. On the day the infant of the miller's daughter died in the healer's arms, he declared a fast across St. Bergrin, not for grief, but for the dangers unweighed in unnatural mercy. Still, the dead quieted. Still, the breathless ones drew breath. Still, she scattered salt beneath the beds of the newly feeble, and left strings of thyme on the latches, and burned the milkweed in the fire pit before new snow. But something shifted, not in her hands, in the soil. The pauper's cemetery behind the chapel began to sag in peculiar ways. Graves slumped like melting wax. Bones, once properly buried, rose fingering through the moss, as if the earth no longer held its pact with the dead. The healer was seen walking there twice, barefoot, as always. Once she paused before a child's mound and whispered, though none heard words. Once she wept, or rather, her face moved as if it did. The village watched from far windows and told themselves she was only praying for the one she'd failed. But a new fear bloomed, slow, root-thick, and resilient. Some began to say that her cures cost something, that each life burned another name from beneath the soil. The codex blackened more around the edges. A fire gutted the stables, though no storm had passed. The eldest goat, born on the month of the first cures, gave birth to a lamb with no eyes and 2 tongues. It lived 3 days. The butcher refused to touch the meat. Snow fell late, and melted too early. The healer drew a map once in charcoal on a child's slate. It showed the village, the fields, the woods, and 3 marks, crescents, drawn outside the old abandoned granary. She said only, "Those do not belong," and swept the slate clean before the mother could ask what she meant. Salt began to rot in the bowls. The carpenter's daughter found her birchwood platter crusted not with holy water, but a gray bloom that gnawed the meat and the glaze alike. They buried the dish, dug it back the next week, out of dread. It was gone. Still, the sick came to her stone-lined home. Still, she gave without demand. Still, salt lines bloomed faintly wherever she passed in darkness. Some say her hands smelled cruel. Others say they smelled like oceans returned. She wore no veil, but something veiled began to move around her, a slowness, like breath that had decided it no longer cared to warm. When the miller's youngest dreamt of her walking backward through the fields while all the cows wept, the vicar declared it an omen. It was not her cure that turned them. It was the pause afterward, as if death were not wholly undone, but waiting. Some say the smell in the soil was the truth rising again. Others believe it was merely rain. Still, the ground no longer settled the same way when she walked. And in the codex, a new page appeared, one no one remembered seeing before, edged with ink too dark for lamplight. It bore a single seed, painted in crescent strokes of ash. No one touched it. They never found it again. But the ledger gained a smell it had never carried before, a grave's breath. And so they began to wonder, has she cured the sick, or only borrowed time from the buried? The path they eventually stopped using had never been much more than a rutted trace through elderwood and stone. It wound in slow preparation, flattening faintly wherever drovers once rolled barrels or monks passed in pairs, humming thin as breath. But even when the road welcomed strangers, St. Bergren never truly opened. It was a place built between hesitations, with more locks than hinges, more boundaries than borders. Its church stood not at the center, but off-kilter, near the slope water, where nettles grew tallest and the flint birds urged sleep with their circling cries. When the last frost refused to leave in the year of the second plague breeze, the path then gave itself fully to mud. What carts remained sank, and the villagers let them. It was the carpenter's son who first noticed the soot upon the milestone. Once a welcoming mark etched with scallop symbols by those heading east on the slower road to Rouen, it stood 3 palms high beneath the linden trees. A marker of refuge. But the scallops were nearly black now, smeared unevenly with the soot of something recently extinguished. Not firewood, but lamp oil, bitter and unnatural. He pointed it out before morning mass, voice hushed. The vicar did not touch the stone, nor bless it. He seemed not startled, simply smaller. Rumor moved slower than rumor used to. It no longer came on tongues, but on gestures. The way a woman closed a shutter, or how a child avoided the step where blood had once pooled and left no stain. Still, it carried enough. After the visits began to cost more in whispers than tokens, the gate was barred. Not a full seal, not a decree, but a quiet refusal. The steward spoke with broad words about rest, about warding, about letting the season turn in peace. But the pause after his final sentence weighed too heavy. It was not peace he conjured. It was fear dressed in patience. The healer was seen less often in day. Her steps pressed no deeper in the path. Her silence no greater. But her absence became shaped, like a coat removed on a windless evening. Only the signs remained. Bundles of marigold on sills where the elderly lay coughing, ash thread looped beneath the sheep crooks, small marks under window panes, circles cleaved with 6 notches, like a sun pressed round by boundary. When the widow Albret was found standing barefoot in her flooded onions, staring toward the path with her hair uncombed and her skirts inside out, she was taken indoors and given broth. But no one asked what she saw. They'd already guessed. She said nothing, save for a single word before twilight. Closer. They say the road never dried again, not all the way. Even on wind-warm days, when salt swept the barrels and the roof thatch hissed with heat, the path curved toward that old soot-marked milestone always remained soft. Travelers turned back if they could. Horses grew strange near the bend and would not stall. One cart overturned not far from the turn. The driver, bruised and blinking, said he'd seen a child standing in the ditch, a girl with her feet in the water and a violet in each hand. She never moved, never blinked, and the road soon swallowed his left wheel. The healer once wore violets in her laces. Those who remembered said they dried purple-black by the time she wrapped them, and no more children were born whole. In households where the healer had been, infants bloomed blue or glass-cold, or arrived silent. Not all, but too many. The midwife's ledger bore the same crooked script for those entries. Child arrived. Poor breath. She wrote it so often the phrase began to lose shape. But even before breathlessness, there were signs. The salt bowls turned gritty, as if their purity had begun to judge them. Wind passed through rooms with no entry. Coals, banked and blessed before sleep, flared once, then died before dawn. The candles near the shrine of Saint Germain melted sideways, yet no warmth reached them. And still the sick did not die. Paradox bloomed thick as elderberries in the bramble. Where death should have triumphed, it paused. Lament, cowed, but where life should have taken root, it soured, became stunted, crooked. A merchant's boy who survived the pox grew scales across his ankles. Not hard skin, scales like river perch. When the apothecary poured vinegar, they hissed. But the healer had touched him once, marked his brow with salt water, and said nothing. Some say she sealed her knowledge behind silence. Others believe she only ever listened. The path twisted because the land did. Beneath the wide elms where the road once turned gold with moss flower, came a hollowing, a slow collapse of earth that exposed roots dry at their core, though water ran above. 3 times the steward placed new stones, each marked with the sigil of pilgrimage. 3 times they cracked and fell. And then there was the girl born in Winter's Tale, dark-haired and mewling. She had 9 teeth on arrival. The healer was not present. They say that mattered. Others say it did not. The girl lasted 3 days. Her death was not peaceful. And yet, the midwife kept the cradle, polished it, smoothed the burned knots, stored it. No one spoke of that year's crops. They were neither failure nor feast. They simply came, half-rotted, and were eaten full of grateful dread. In the prayer house, the steward found a bundle behind the loose stone, the same one children had long avoided for reasons few remembered. Inside, a thumb-sized charm of bleached waxwood, etched with the reverse of the old Latin benedicite. The wound in the wood ran with old wax. Dried violet petals had been affixed with what looked like spit. They burned it without question, but no smoke rose. The healer did not ask why she was not told. She simply left 3 lines of salt beside the chapel the next day. Even the sheep stopped grazing near that path. When the red-feathered jay vanished, once thought sacred, as it circled the towers each morning, a shadow fell sharper onto parish pages. The vicar inked a note in his book of misrule. Feathers do not fall where she passes. A silence is nesting. No one walked the road again, not out of law, but because the mire knew their weight now, knew where to hold tighter. Travelers who came seeking shelter were sent on. Those who asked for healing were told only, not now. When one persisted, a widow with a son coughing blood and sea foam, she was guided to the milestone, the soot still there, and given no further direction. She did not make it past dusk. The boy lingered long enough to see frost on the path begin to melt in a single, crooked stripe. No one buried them under their full names. The road vanished in summer, but in winter, its ghost returned. Wolves were heard in starlight, drawn by something unspoken. Some say it was the cured. Others say the not yet damned. A prayer was inscribed on the chapel doors that year, in a hand now lost. Let no breath follow. Let no foot pass. The healer was not named, but the ink bled, and the soot thickened. The road in was no longer taken. The road out remained softer still. A child carved a name into a tree near its curve. Not her name, but something close. 11 strokes. The bark peeled itself away within a month. Soon after, that child vanished. Some claimed he had gone north with a pilgrim band. Others heard crying where the road once split. They followed it. It led only to salt. The bowls appeared with the first stretch of sun after the dark season began to loosen its grip, placed one by one at the lip of every door that once received her shadow. Small and rough-drawn, as if shaped not on the wheel but from the press of tired hands. No two the same depth. Each cradled a bed of salt, coarse and pink with flecks of black, and each was buried beneath violet petals so pale they seemed faded by memory, not just time. At first, the gesture was accepted. A ward, perhaps. A peace. One widow wept as she found her bowl and bent to kiss the edge. Another lifted the dish inside and placed it between her shutter and the rising wind. But on the 3rd day, the petals in the baker's bowl had darkened, not wilted, but turned the shade of old wounds, dull and sweet and final. She scattered them before her door and did not open it again until the frost killed all scent. Whispers formed before language. People asked with glances, nods, or strange lingering breath that trembled in doorways when they passed. Did your petals turn? Did your salt clump? Did anything reach the center? No one burned the bowls. That would have meant destroying something meant to protect, or something meant to bind. Salt in the old tongue meant more than flavor, more than worth. It was ward. It was right. It was sign. In St. Bergeron, salt had always been kept high, on shelves near icons, or strung in sachets the sick could not reach. It was not food but promise, a pact once forged before the town had a name. And now that pact was being rewritten. A second dish appeared on the lintel of the Cooper's home, where his wife had refused the healer's help the previous October. By nightfall, the brine in that dish had leached into the wood. Their doorstep curled and cracked by morning, as though fingers had pressed open its grain from below. The healer never approached them, but a third dish appeared that week, this time beyond the village barriers entirely, left just above the soil in the field where the carpenter's twins had once coughed themselves blue. They found it while chasing a threadbare hoop. One boy pointed, the other whispered. The petals there were whole, untouched, but when rain came, the bowl refused to flood. They upturned it in secret. Underneath, a hollow had formed. Nothing large, only a cup's worth of sunless earth. But inside it were 6 tiny pins, blackened to pitch. Some say they were teeth. Others say they were seeds. No one touched them. The bowl was buried. But the twins stopped sleeping in the same room. The healer said little, no more or less than before. Her tinctures still came in lengths of scrimshaw tube, sealed with wax and thorn. When opened, they smelled not of rot or wine, but stone, and something older, something like the smell beneath church flagstones. Receivers swore their skin flushed a little when they drank, as if the body met truth halfway. And yet, where the tinctures once cooled fever, they now stirred the question of its absence. Children who drank her blue thistle infusion stopped crying in pain. Yes, but also in everything else. Painless, they stared for hours. Wooden, pliant. Healed, some insisted. Hollowing, said the rest. But still they came. Rib-cracked mothers. Men with blood in their spit. Infants too young to protect and too old to consent. They came because reaping season had brought black swellings again, and the priest's chant no longer clung to the rafters. They passed her no coins. Only handmade salt, pressed into bricks, string-wrapped, and often bitten before offered. Some were refused and returned wordlessly. Some were taken. The healer's door never bore bowls. Only the sign, scratched deep and wide across the lintel. 3 salt marks, staggered like steps. A gull's footprint, some called it. A wave swallowing light, said others. Her chimney never smoked. Her voice never shouted. Yet signs bloomed. Children scratched at their arms, their healed arms, the ones she'd poulticed with larch and soot, saying they itched in the shape of her hands. One girl found petals in her bed where none had bloomed in months. And one boy gave back a tongue of salt she had never placed in his mouth. He had not spoken since. The vicar read aloud each morning from the Book of Pleas, though few still came to listen. He intoned Latin with the dry pace of famine, translating poorly, as though unsure the words endured. One sermon paused entirely when he read a passage of healing. He coughed, said nothing, and turned the page backward. His bowl did not turn, only faded. And then there was the washerwoman who opened her door one morning to find not salt and petals, but salt and ash. She did not weep. She did not speak. She took a stick of candlewood and smeared the ash inside her own mouth. "Let no more breath deceive," she whispered. She lived 5 more months. Her shadow never reappeared. Salt that should wound began to mark her presence. Behind the chapel, salt slicks formed where shadow fell wrong. It came up between bricks, around the oil font, along the threshold of the storage shed where the steeple bell rope had frayed. Water drawn from the village pump burned with brine when drunk cold. Animals refused it, began to seek out puddles instead, even in filth. And the petals changed again. A boy of 4 found a cluster growing near the old stone, where once pilgrims had passed. They were violets only by shape. Their color was the blue of burned cloth, edges curled inward, as if pulled from fire and frost together. He plucked 3, and that night, his father dreamed of salt lakes filled with teeth. They never spoke of it again. The boy's curls lost all color within a week. What the healer gave seemed less like healing now, more like barter. An old economy few remembered, but which the land understood. Something taken replaces something lost. But the exchange had grown uneven. The healthy became strange. The strange became quiet. And silence became a prayer none dared say aloud. Some tried cleansing. They burned rosemary at their thresholds, washed lentils with milk. One woman left her husband's boots on the stoop, healed feet or not, claiming their souls wept salt into the thatch. Two brothers dug up their mother's dish after her passing to test its contents. The salt was gone. Only petals remained, dried, but soft. They tasted her name on their tongues for days, a name they swore they never knew. When a cattle thief passed through, coughing hard and leaking bile, the villagers watched in stillness. One asked if the healer might help. Another spat into the bowl on his door and said, "Let him try herbs alone." The man died by sunrise, but the moss where he bled grew long and blue-veined. The salt dishes lingered that winter longer than frost. By early spring, they had begun to frost themselves. They say salt cannot freeze, but dreams did. Each family hoarded petals differently. Some placed them beneath the tongue, others tossed them to the hearth with breathless hope. But none dared destroy them. When the first dish cracked from within, no pressure, no strike. Only a bloom of sound at midnight that woke no dogs, only people. It was followed the next night by another. Then another. Soon fragment found fragment in the fields, half buried as if grown, neatly fractured down their seam. Inside some, new petals. Inside one, a sliver of black glass. Inside another, a thumbprint, still damp. A girl buried hers beneath the step. It returned the next morning, uncracked, unsoiled, waiting. She screamed only once. Then silence as still as drought fell over her family for a full week. The healer was not summoned to their door again. The bowls finally disappeared by the third thaw. No one saw them go. They simply ceased. But for weeks after, salt trails formed faintly in strange places. Where pigeons grazed. Where teeth had fallen. Where breath caught sharp before the word mercy. Some say she placed the last bowl herself. Not in the village, but beyond. On a stone unhewn by hand, near the place where fences shiver and names no longer carry their sound. The soil there, they said, curdled when watered. The stone split the next season. Nothing grew near it, save for 5 leaves too perfectly arranged to be wind-dropped. They reeked of ash and echo, and beneath them, faint as breath on stone, was the outline of a bowl. It was a book not meant to open. Bound in calfskin spoiled too early, its cover bore the scent of sour fat and wax, like candles left to rot in a sealed drawer. The clasp was a common parish lock, split-tongued, iron-board, sealed shut with a stamp whose sigil had worn smooth from prayer thumb and heat. Hidden for years, it had lain beneath the crypt steps, behind a limp of blackwood peeled inward by centuries of mice and moss. But floods do not always take permission. The winter rains that year pressed inward like fingers, seeping through stone and softening the ledge. And when the vicar ordered the floor lifted in effort to rebind the chapel foundation, the ledger came forward, unfolded, even, open somehow, but untouched by water and turning of its own weight. The first page was smooth and sharply scribed, with notations in 2 hands. One bold and blocky, one narrow, tilted backward slightly, as if trying not to be read. There were lists of afflictions, numbers, names half-crossed, herbs spelled in old church romance no longer taught after Rouen schools burned through. Some entries ended with initials, some declared granted relief, and others, only a mark like a closed loop, perhaps meaning silence, perhaps meaning end. The name Alan appeared thrice without striking. No surname, no seal, and beside it, relieved of black mouth. Child hole. Black mouth was a word not spoken since the first wind brought the coughing deaths. a name given by wives and notaries to the rot that bloomed behind gums and breathed itself into cloth. Few survived. Records never bothered with cures, only cautions: how long the victims lived, whether they ran or collapsed, and how deep to dig to keep the ground clean. Yet here, in unmildewed page, the claims stood steady. Child whole. That child, Etienne, son of Barthélemy, was buried the previous year. A lichen-heavy grave marked only by a spindle carved in elder wood, placed crooked by an earth too damp to hold its shape. The vicar sat with the ledger until breath slowed into dusk, skimming with cautious discipline, as if his eyes might smudge the ink. He did not speak of what he found for days. When asked by the steward if anything holy had been recoiled, he simply coughed. Once, and nodded sideways. But the book did not leave the chapel again. It was locked each night behind the reliquary's gate, a cage built not to hold relics, but to protect them from those who might reconsider their fire. Some say the pages turned on their own, that the steward, once caught alone with it, heard a breath where none had stood, and saw his uncle's name listed under tincture denied. But he died in childbirth, hadn't he? Before the steward was old enough to remember. Doubt whispers louder than proof. Still, the writing endured. The backward slanted hand chronicled visits not publicly known. Old maidens healed of wasting skin. Miners from beyond St. Bergrin who brought bad air in their clothes, lungs blackened to collapse, now delivering sacks of salt to the chapel in payment without bid. More troubling still, some entries bore nativities and deaths unmatched. One girl, Anseline, born during the first frost after the healer's appearance, listed as cured of Lenten spleen on Candlemas, yet recorded in the burial log for St. Valerie 2 months earlier. Her name marked with both ink and ash. The village clerk blamed scribal error, offered generational mistakes. Names repeated often in family lines. But when 3 more crosses matched this pattern, cured after death, he stopped speaking when others asked questions. He began sleeping with salt wrapped in his palm. Each Sunday, the vicar read more. His sermons shrank. No mention was made of the bishop's seasonal letters, nor of the indulgences briefly offered for parish repairs. Every week, he grew thinner, lighter in the chair. His voice dried. Mornings, he smelled of beeswax and old rose. Not the fresh kind, the kind taken from graves. Then came the entry that folded inward. Toward the end of that same volume, pages beyond where the clasp ought to have stopped, was a single sheet heavier than the others. The ink ran long, curling into itself, prose and margin filled with dark curling script, no gaps for breath. It described no cure. It named no person, only practices. Hands drawn with thread-stitched lines. A tongue marked at 4 places. A candle cut with skullcap. Water boiled down 8 times. No firewood, only oil. It ended with something that was not Latin, not French, not anything remembered. The text blurred. The vicar hid it, swore to keep it locked. But 2 altar boys found him later that week, kneeling before the bell slag behind the chapel, digging into ash with bare hands. In his grip, violet petals dried to silver. The ledger vanished the following month. No fire reported, no theft, only a hush, announced by the steward, and seconded by the wife of the sacristan who claimed to have seen him place the book into a hide pouch, stitch it shut with gut thread, and bury it beneath the veined hill where the grass folds back slowly in storm. They salted the spot after, but that next spring, mold refused to grow there. The healer never spoke of the ledger. Those who believed it hers did not ask. Those who feared it dared not. What it knew, they said, was not illness, but consequence. A midwife, long widowed and weary of wringing cloth over brow, once said aloud what others would not. If cure comes from where no prayer walks, where do the healed go? No one answered. But that same week, the altar cloth stiffened with salt, and the basin water turned violet. The townsfolk began uncoupling questions from answer, not asking why one girl no longer dreamt, or why her feet never showed chill. not asking how the chimney smoke knew not to return, or how the healer's cord left no mark in the snow. Silence gathered as a remedy of its own. Then came the second ledger. They found it where no book should be, in the abandoned stable, hidden behind the bridle hooks, wrapped in soot-smudged wool used for swaddling not beasts, but infants. Lighter in weight, but thick. Its cover white birch, lashed clean with wax cord. The title marked in a language none spoke, but the drawing told its shape, a tongue cradled in 2 black leaves. Inside, familiar script. Backward tilt. No names. No dates. Only instructions. Wet ash finds what flame forgets. Herbs must be bruised upon breath before they recall their shape. The last page bore 3 ink rings, and a trace of something oily, bitter to the nose. One woman cut her finger on the edge of the final page. A week later she stopped bleeding entirely, though no wound remained. The book too vanished, but not before 6 villagers tasted page corners during a windless dusk and refused bread forever after. When someone dared write the healer's name inside the church's baptismal stone, etched clean and sure with charcoal, not a breath stirred altar side that Sunday. The candles did not light. The infant began to speak, not words, only syllables. And still the healed slept more than they woke. Still the salt dishes, when found buried backward, bore signs of small hands pressed from beneath. Still, the codex found first, long gone, left the scent of sweet rot behind in the chapel vault, though all stone had been scrubbed and sealed. Ink stains crept up the spine of one boy's prayer book. When asked, he said it smiled at him, but he couldn't read the words, and no one showed him, because they had begun to understand. The healer did not leave records, only ledgered debts no one dared repay. Smoke in St. Bertrand did not rise without being watched, not after the harvest rains that twisted the wheat and sent black sprigs through the barley field, creeping low and slow like something breathing through wool. It wasn't the air exactly. The air still moved, but there was a hush in it now, a kind of closing, as if each hour had to be held still in the hand before it could settle into time. That winter, when fires were lit, they felt different. Bark hissed longer. Coals flared low before they warmed. Chimneys pulled too quickly, sucking breath from throats not their own. Even candlewick, once holy, refused symmetry, burning with forked flame or none at all. So when the smoke curled high above the chapel spire, gray, then black, then stained with something colder, each soul with salt on their lintel felt their body still. There was no scream, no bell, just the steady column rising like a stalk twisted by winter, and the knowledge that something had unlatched inwards before it washed over the stone. The fire did not take the whole chapel, only the tower, only the bell, the one that had not rung in more than 2 seasons, not since the healer refused to attend St. Hilda's Day, saying simply, "The wind isn't clean." That bell, highest and oldest, cast from iron laced with stolen nails from pilgrim staffs, had once been rung to clear the air during fevers, to chase death from alleys too poor to purify with lime. 10 of them hung in the tower. That was the largest. The 10th, forged last, rung least, but hardest when struck. Only it burned, not shattered, not melted. It burned. Rope, wood, parchment, and vestments. Yes, those might burn. But iron? Burned like dry peat, they said. Shimmered red down the seam, folded in upon itself like bread scored too deep. The timber above it hissed. The rafters fell in prayer position, and when they beat back the flames with calfskin and birch buckets, the bell sat smoldering, not sunken but peeled. It turned to ash with no help from weather, crumbled under the steward's hand when he tried to brush the rim in disbelief. Only the clapper remained unblackened, and it rang once without string when he dropped it. That note carried a taste on the tongue. Salt. They covered it in cloth and tied it under the altar. The rest, they tucked into verses about quick response and divine mercy, composed by the vicar's own hand, though the script lacked his pressure. and still they did not speak her name. The healer had not been near the tower. She had not touched the rope. She had not breathed toward the bell. But the boy who carved the stair beneath it knelt in the square the next morning with ash on both palms, mouth open, waiting for words that would not come. He never built again. Days later, they found the bolted door at the top of the stairs shifted ajar, though the lock remained intact. Inside, claw marks, high up along the beam. Not gouged, not splintered, but pressed outward, as if something within the wall had stretched against it and left behind no splinter, only shape. The priest claimed vermin. Crows, perhaps, or foxes nesting where the rafters rotted. But no feathers were seen. No fur. No stain. No track. Only the smell, acrid and gone before one could mark where it had been strongest. A smell that pulled blood to the surface when breathed deep. They blessed the walls 3 times. But the next morning, no birds came. No bells rang, and the rope, once stored in deference to different days, was found woven with brine crust near the base. Rusted, stiff, and torn near the place where the clapper should have swung. The tower was sealed. Not out of fear, they said, but in reverence. But the door was never quite still after that. Wind pressed it now. Rain bent to it. Children dreamed of it opening even when it did not. One child said she had heard weeping from the bell itself, as if it remembered the hands that cast it and still waited for the 7th note they never allowed it to sing. The ledger of the layman, once hidden, mentioned no fire. But later pages began to bear sketches in pale hand ink. Circles with cuts through their center. Bells wreathed in roots. A mouth closed in soot. She had stood outside the church once, not long before this. She leaned her shoulder into the stone and hummed until the weather glass atop the tower cracked in 2. Some say it wasn't her, that it was the wind. But the wind doesn't choose words. That Sunday, instead of the 10th bell, they rang the 4th twice. And it broke the next day. From then onward, they rang only the 5th and 6th, and only at dusk. When visitors came to ask how the tower still stood when the bell burned within, they were shown the chapel's wide floor, its uncracked stone, its sootless eaves. They were told the fire was small, the loss contained, the damage only spiritual. But one of those visitors, a lamp maker from Louvain, left an offering at the healer's door before leaving, and whispered to the wind, "You kept it from falling. I don't know what keeps you now." She returned the next day. Her gift, a wick braided of violet fiber, had turned stiff and black, as if eyed by flame and found wanting. That spring, the newer bells rang thinly. They echoed wrong across the slope. Crows circled lengthwise, never alighting. The air around the tower waited, pressing downward, making young priests sweat at the temple and elders lose their step near the nave. Smells began to ripple without source. Oak breath, burned linen, milk turned in pewter. The vicar began drawing oil crosses in places no one could explain. Behind the confessional, along the grain bin behind the kitchen, once even upon the boots of his assistant when he found trace of violet beneath the heel. No one heard the 10th bell again, but in dreams the note lingered. Once, twice, and then always cut short. Men who rang it before it perished reported throat aches. One lost the ability to hum. Another found all the salt in his home turned wet, even sealed. The clapper beneath the altar began to warm against the stone, so they covered it in lard and rose ash, and sealed it beneath beeswax. Still, children who passed over it grew colder around the chest. Not ill, just slower to breathe, longer to wake. The steward's own niece grew her first tooth along the cuff of her foot, not hard, but white and pure as bone. Her salt dish bloomed early that year. Inside, a petal arranged in the shape of a bell beneath a crescent moon. The moon turned brown within days. The family left her cradle by the well, and crooned stories in whispers until the marsh mist claimed the voice for itself. The bell no longer speaks, but the wind remembers what the 10th would have said. It began with fever drawn deep into the spine, the kind that whispers from shoulder to hip, then rests between breaths. waiting just long enough to be forgotten before returning in coils. The kind fire cannot reach and blankets cannot hush. That season, when the frost left, it took with it more than it gave. The breathlessness returned in segments. Boys too quiet, men too quick to sit, women whose fingers curled without reason and would not release again. It wasn't plague, they said, not the real kind, not the black slick swellings or the peeled skin. But it was sickness nonetheless, and it limped through the village, counting throats. They remembered ash wine then. Old remedy, older than books, predating even the steward's ledgers, passed through mouths worn brittle with prayer and salted bread. Ash wine, steeped elderflower, boiled soot, warmed by pebbled fire, and stirred with a wand of thorn dipped thrice in saint water. Once reserved for midwives expecting grief or wanderers coughing brine. Too precious, too potent for common colds, and known to burn its drinkers from sternum to groin, leaving the mouth dry but the eyes flushed full. Still, it worked. Sometimes. And that was more than silence. But the recipe had changed. Or the world had. The ash no longer softened the wine. It darkened. The flavor thickened behind the teeth and lingered there, not as bitterness, but as something flattened, like sound pressed too tightly inside clay. Those first to drink wept for no reason, mouths stained violet without the presence of berries. Their breath grew full of something old. Not rot, not ruin, but dust remembered too long. The healer had not offered the ash wine at first. She had buried 6 bowls of it in the eastern hollow during the last waning moon before frost. The earth refused all trace of their presence. Bowls melted back into root line, steam faintly visible for days only to those who did not seek it. But the illness returned with rhythm, and she brought it again. Quietly, not to doorways, to the base of trees. She left no names, just vessels. Hollow-stemmed ladles carved to resemble the crook of a bishop's staff, worn smooth at the pinch point by use or time. Each was wrapped in bee skin, stitched with waxed cloth that smelled faintly of grave flowers and old prayer pages. The wine inside the ladles burned cold. Cold first, then sharp, then warm beneath the tongue. Those who drank were never asked if they healed. It was visible. Wrists uncurled. Red faded. Breath returned, but so did other things. Slowness, a stillness many couldn't shake, tics they hadn't known in childhood, a dread made of quiet. One girl, previously mute since the smoke took her ailing mother that winter, regained her voice after the ladle touched her tongue. But she spoke only a single phrase, repeated each dusk as the bells tolled absent. He is beneath the hill, not sleeping. She never changed her inflection. Never blinked while speaking, never woke fully before sundown. Her ladle was returned to the healer, but it reappeared 2 days later, placed beside the widow's wheelbarrow, full again. The widow did not touch it. Her dog did. The next morning it was gone, and the dog sat still-eyed in the yew shade, unmoving, blinking only when rain fell directly against its snout. They found the hollow-stemmed ladles again when the field behind the granary smoked without flame. Not fire smoke, not warmth, just a thin wisp echoing from a dip in the grass, visible only in certain light. The ladle there had turned black around the handle, but gleamed inside. The wine was thick as chalked ink, and moving slightly, as if stirred from beneath. A boy drank it on a dare. He screamed once, then whispered for 9 days, only to a white stone. Each day he sat facing the same direction, lips moving fast and quiet, hands clutched beneath his knees. No one dared stop him. On the 10th day, he grew silent, then feverish, then died, not coughing, not bleeding, only still, breath paused between beginnings. But the stone stayed warm. The midwife found a ladle buried halfway beneath the old yew, half filled. Its stem marked with sigils she said resembled teeth. Not human ones. Hollow ovals, dusted dark. She poured it out over the roots. But the ground did not drink. 3 days later, the silo swayed under moonlight without wind. The healer said nothing, but a second ladle appeared, with a leather wrapping the color of clotted cream, burnt at one edge. "Marked already," the smith said, nodding solemnly. He drank it by dawn. 3 days later, his foot began to twist backward. Not fractured, not frostbit, but turned, like wood grown in darkness reaching for water far away. He walked still, but in circles. The ash wine was always warm, even left out, even beneath the frost. It smelled different for each person, sweet to some, bitter to others. One girl fainted at the scent alone. An older man said it called something forward, laughter he couldn't place. Another poured it into a grave he'd not spoken of in 40 years. It hissed, then stopped. That location is now U-ringed, circled by children who speak in rhyme when passing, even though none admit to starting the chant. Ash wine should not live longer than light. That was the rule. Its potency faded in hours. But these remained, held form, even tasted stronger. When ash turns to ink, the blood listens. The midwife muttered once, then bit her tongue. Records began to blur. The ledger once kept by Father Aramon showed strange inking on older entries. Cured turned to marked. Relieved grew slashes at the edges. Some pages wouldn't dry, smelling faintly of ash wine long after the quill was put away. Someone tried to test the wine. The village's only clerk, a man with teeth stained by inkroot and hands precise from decades sorting coins, took a ladle behind the granary and heated it with iron tongs above a clean flame. It boiled in silence, then reformed. The ladle snapped. He was not seen for 5 days. When he returned, he had shaved one side of his scalp bald, saying the wind had chosen that part for him. When asked, he only answered, "It won't burn again." Villagers began marking samples, tying threads to the stems, tracking which returned. One did, except the thread was gone. Instead, a single violet petal floated on the surface. It was unbruised. Ladles soon found their way into locked places. The ruined chapel vestibule, the goat pen, the abandoned forge. No one knew who placed them, but each arrived when the occupant had whispered, even once, about not trusting fire. The midwife found one beneath her own cot. Empty, dry, but its scent lingered 3 days. The tooth wrapped in her apron came loose the same night. The church bells, those still surviving, refused to ring on days when ash wine was poured. Ropes jammed, weights tangled, voices failed. A swarm of hoverflies circled one ladle for 4 hours. They did not land. When the baker's son knelt beside one and drank from the stem instead of the bowl, his dreams lengthened. His mother claimed he now spoke recipes not yet invented, heat instructions for ovens no one had built. The bread since then has risen higher, but it does not spoil. Some say this is grace. Others, preservation meant to outlast the mouth. The ashes gathered in small piles beside drained ladles. Dark gray, soft, and warm when handled. A girl pressed them beneath the floorboard of her dying brother's room. He lived 3 more months, but stared only at the ceiling. When he died, salt bloomed beneath his cot. The girl does not speak now, only sings with her head turned sideways. The healer no longer delivered ladles by hand. They appeared where breath paused. Always warm, always half full. No one claimed making them, but every so often, a violet stem was found among the ashes. Still wet, still pulsing, still humming faintly when held too near the ear. The cottage where it took place had no name anymore. Not long after the midwife closed what remained of her voice behind the door. It was near the orchard, set deep into the clay slope just above the last salt field, where the wind failed to turn on time. The trees there bloomed sideways that year, their branches furred before the buds knew to open, as though the bloom refused direction. The chimney leaned slightly eastward, its mouth always dry, as if the smoke never stayed long enough to stain. It had once belonged to a tanner, then a widow, then to no one at all. By the time the healer walked past its threshold, the door hadn't been touched in at least a season. But she stepped inside as though she'd been sent for. No shout had summoned her, no bell rung. None of the neighbors had seen movement. Only the candle, lit too early for dusk, too late for fear. A single flame moving slow across the small, square window, bowed slightly inward like a breath had been trapped inside and wanted out. The midwife had gone there herself only that morning, quietly. Not to practice, not to call. She had not taken her herbs, not her birthing cloth, just a pail of water that never reached the fire. But the screams came, not at night, not from outside, from within, bent through the walls, not like suffering, but like something being undone and done again very quickly, raw and deliberate. There was no pattern to them, no rhythm for any midwife to catch with the breath or anchor with prayer. Only the way they rose, startled, urgent, and sharp like steam shooting from fresh split stone. When silence returned, none left the hearth. None asked what had been done. The next morning, the tree out front burned. Only the trunk, not the roots. Only to the waist, not the crown. Fire that knows how far to go. The midwife returned home before dawn. Her eyes were blank with clarity. Her hands folded in a way the villagers had only seen once, at her own child's funeral. She said no words, stirred no pots, blew no herbs. She was seen briefly kneeling before the healed girl from the spring prior, the one who still spoke only to the well. Then the midwife closed her shutters and did not break bread again. The child was never shown. Some say the healer cradled it in wax-wrapped blankets, so carefully stitched the folds looked carved. Others say it did not need wrapping, but it was done anyway, to keep the salt from reaching its pores too early. A few believe no child was born, that the candle burned for something else entirely. A warning, perhaps, or witness, maybe both. But afterward, 2 women were seen carrying a cradle wrapped in waxed cloth. Too large for a newborn, too light for the frame. They placed it in the grain cellar. Only the steward dared lift it. They say his breath caught in his nose after opening the cloth. He did not cry, only blinked, and said, "It's dry," then left the cellar and did not sleep that night. When it was opened again, a week later, for grain sealing, the cradle was empty. The cloth had been ripped along one seam. A single blood filament, fine and arcing, ran along the inner rail. No prints, no hairs, no refuse. The clear, unmistakable scent of beeswax, though no wax residue remained. The grain they sealed afterward fermented early. It hissed each time the door opened, even for air. And all of the children in the village began waking at once. At the same time each night, just before the hour the candle had gone out. The healer's presence lingered differently after that. There was a warmth to it, but not comfort. Warm like stone in a sealed room. Like a blanket drawn too close to be refused. When she walked past mothers in the square, their infants drooled salt at the lip, even when no food had passed their gums. Several young girls, yet unbent by blood or grief, began to cover their navels with pressed moss stitched into their underthings. They said it made the dreams stay quiet. Fathers went quiet too. Some buried linens without names or blood, just to still the air at night. There were no songbirds near the cottage afterward, just one jackdaw that watched. People swore it never blinked. And at dawn, it was gone. The midwife, still silent, began to tie threads around her wrists in uneven numbers, those closest to her palms always red, those closer to her elbows white or gray. She didn't explain, only tightened them when asked. And when someone reached for the cloth around her left wrist, she hissed, not loud, but sharp, more animal than woman. When the priest tried to speak to her, he brought 3 soaked wafers and a pitcher of wine. She slapped the cup across the stairs without raising her hand more than an inch. The wine did not stain the wood, but the slabs beneath it took on a sheen. Not crimson, opal. For a full day, they shimmered against stormlight, as if considering letting something up. After that, no more blessings came to the cottage. But salt did, drawn nightly in the circle, then double-lined. Not by her, they said, by something moved in streaks too thin to be finger. Petal dust among the grains confirmed it. The steward finally asked the question, who had been helped? Who had been born into what silence? The answer didn't come in words. It came in breath. On the south edge of the chapel lawn, where wood had been stacked since before the fire, fresh straw was left bundled in the shape of a child. Not swaddled, cradled. It bore no markings. Yet bees came, hung above it like smoke, as though memory had gravity. The midwife still stirred thin broth each morning and left it to steam beside her sill. But she did not eat. Her shawl, once stitched with green and gold, frayed to near black. Yet she did not mend. Each fray was marked with thorn. That spring, a cow bore a calf already weaned. Its eyes were sealed shut by brine. No midwife touched it. No dog barked at it. But for 3 nights it circled the healer's home, then was found beneath the old yew, curled perfectly against the root. Dead, but without collapse, as if placed to sleep and told not to stir. The healer passed the wheat circle soon after, arms unladen, head uncovered. Behind her, children born before that winter stopped crying altogether. Not always, just in unison. Not grief, not hunger, just stillness. Each slid into it like breath paused mid-lullaby. The priest tried to write a sermon about hope. The page soaked through before the ink touched it. The next child born was a girl with no tongue, but she sang when the yew trees shook. No lullaby, only a sound like salt water through a trough of wood. The midwife stopped tying thread after that. She watched the trees instead, and sometimes, they said, she wept into her shirt without moving her face. The healer still moved through the eastern tract, but no more children were born. Every cradle was burned in hush. Babies were not named until their second spring. Until then, they were called only by their salt, coarse, fine, bitter, sweet. The one called half-bloom slept uncovered even in frost, and never blinked first. The candle from the nameless cottage still has no wax, but each year it burns, just before the winds shift, and the cry that comes after is never from the living side of the wood. The saints stopped watching during Lent, not suddenly, but by increments so small no one wished to be the first to name them. At first it was the eyes. The black scara of Saint Langier, once warm with beeswax sheen, now dulled with a faint film. Not blindness, but disinterest. Then the crook of Saint Bergrin himself, turned ever so slightly toward the wall of the sacristy, the curl at the end of his staff casting a longer shadow than before. The change could be explained easily during the first week. It had rained, and the roof had carried the damp into the beams. Wood warps under hunger, paint fades under eyes. But during the second week, the saint's hands began to droop. Not fall, none suffered damage, but bent subtly, stiffly, like limbs unsure of their own posture. A boy lighting candles at the altar whispered that Saint Germain's fingers trembled when smoke passed under them. The priest, pale from fasting and stretched thin from failing sleep, said that was nonsense. Still, he burned myrrh after that. The myrrh clung for days, bent every flame in the nave slightly to the left, as if pulled by breath that had no singer. The candles guttered at dawn, but not at dusk. The wax in the votives bubbled without heat. 2 nights later, the statue of Saint Hilaire turned fully. Not merely its posture. Its entire body angled off its marble plinth, facing southwest with eyes to the blank stone. No one had touched it. No ladder had leaned against it. The statue stood over 4 feet high, too dense to move without effort, too sacred to touch without cause. When asked whether a spirit had done it, the priest said, "It is likely mildew, or weakness in the grain. These things do not hold their shape forever." But the grain had been sealed. The base signed with a crescent of salt water and protected 2 harvests prior by the bishop himself. When St. Bergrin's left cheek began to blacken, it was said to be storm rot. But the rain had not reached that wall for months, and a thin line of pitch sweated through the marred wood as though something hidden beneath the paint now bled its way out. The older women in the parish remembered eruptions like this from the ledgers of famine years. Spirits pulling shape from image, Divinity withdrawing from corruption made too welcome. The priest insisted it was nothing, so they cleaned the cheek with cured myrrh, scraped it gently with lye, blessed it twice, but the spot grew back once more by morning. Then a child touched the hem of St. Mylene's carving and cried aloud without words. When pressed, the child said only that he had seen something lift behind her. Not wings, not cloak, just something, like the gust left between two stepping shadows. He could not name it. He would not pass the statue again. 1 week later, the priest found a bowl overturned before the altar. Salt had scattered in uneven loops and folds across the stone, but not a fleck had reached the tabernacle. Beeswax petals were mashed into its edges. When swept, the salt smoked slightly in contact with the broom. That day, the statue of Saint Bergrin was anointed in silence, his face polished, his left eye stained. And though no one said so, many claimed the same thing afterwards. The effigy had tilted slightly backward, away from the altar. When a mirror was brought to inspect, the carved lids had swollen with resin. This swelling could not be softened by any oil. The salt basin at the entryway turned thick that Sunday, the grains clumping together as if they'd been kissed by breath. The children refused to dip their fingers. One girl touched it and began laughing so sharply it fractured into coughing. The laugh did not sound like hers. After 3 days, the tip of her tongue turned pale as lye. Her family left violets at the yew. The girl remained quiet after that. The priest kept his sermons short, watching the statues more than the faces of the faithful. He stopped invoking intercession and began using only the old names: the root, the silence, the light before light. He said they held longer than saints who seemed to lean away now, whose eyes no longer caught the morning sun. It was the entries in the church's account book that spelled the real shift. Next to each saint's name, a tally of offerings, bee charms, barley, petals, salt, had been marked in charcoal, as though someone meant to erode them, not preserve them. 3 were struck out so firmly the parchment ran thin. Under where Saint Auler's offerings had once been listed, a loop of ink shaped exactly like the mouth of a ladle. The healer had not entered the church since the fire, but her presence had visited. The wax on the altar began clumping in salt-shaped crusts. Bread refused to rise when left near the font. Children began to cover the saints' faces with their cloaks when playing nearby. Some say they played in mimic, others from fear. The wood around Saint Evalda cracked. Her face split beneath the lip of her eye. Her hand turned inward. The sacristan said the grain had simply dried, but no books around her shelf curled. No chair splintered. No scrolls unraveled their old ropes. The wind became strange during chant. Where it had once moved gently through the wall slots and made the choir flutter like distant bells, now it did not come at all, or came once, then stopped. When a visiting monk commented that the nave felt emptied of shape, the priest did not respond. He walked into the vault, opened the second drawer of the reliquary, took out a strip of cloth said to belong to an unnamed martyr, and burned it beneath the tabernacle. The ash turned pink as it cooled. A boy later carved a tiny figure. Not a saint, something else. A seated woman with her hands cupped over salt. He hid it under the church rugs, near the patch where water never dried. When found, the priest's hands trembled, but he did not strike or shout. He simply placed it beneath the statue of Saint Bergrin. And the next morning, Bergrin's eyes had turned completely to the wall. The healer said nothing, but violets grew there that season for the first time since they'd begun measuring time by salt. The church was now a presence only of form, not of watching. The saints no longer received their oilings with grace. Their wood cracked without explanation. Cloth coverings turned stiff. One icon's gold leaf dulled overnight, without loss, only absence. Not theft, just leaving. The final effigy to remain unchanged was that of Saint Alberich. The priest guarded it closely, even weaving thorns at its base, until the day the stem of a violet was pushed upward through his matting, without crack, without breach. Only soft determination. The stem curved to the saint's chin, and he, too, then turned. Light through the stained glass no longer touched the altar directly. It broke midair, touched walls instead, and congregants began bringing their salt from home. They did not offer it to the saints, only left it on the floor, one by one, and the wind that passed through them carried scent now, not of mold nor age, but the stillness of things turned inward, waiting. The fever left them. That much was true. For a time, the air cleared, and breath returned without struggle. The wide-eyed children who had once sat with knees to their chests beside the hearths began to stand again. The red cough from their lungs receded, and the shaking underneath their nails stopped. The healer's efforts had not failed. She knew how to pull warmth from the wrist, how to scent the softness between fits and call balance back into blood gone sour. She used salt not in excess, but true, stones rounded by age and brined in smoked herb before laid lightly across wound or lip. It worked. It always had. The village did not say thank you, but they stopped counting the dead. They stopped building up their firewood with such desperation. They began to sleep through the night again. But health, once stolen and returned by strange hands, does not stay where it was put. It glances back. It becomes something else. The fever left, and something unknown was emptied with it. It began with the shepherd's child, a boy healed a month earlier of lesions no one could name. Lesions ringed in bruiseless blue, soft to touch, gone without scar. That child now walked crooked, not limping from ache, but from knowing. As if he had learned in sleep that the earth no longer rose with equal welcome on each side of him. He ran in circles, short ones, and not from hunger for play, but because every time he tried to straighten, his spine hummed like the edge of a cracked bell. The healer looked once upon him in passing and closed her mouth with her hand. But she did not speak. After that came others, too many to ignore. The schoolroom was first to notice it. Rows of children, once noisy with finger drops and string games, now quiet. Their necks hung too low even to nap, and the left legs of nearly all had grown sluggish. One lost the toes without wound. They turned slowly white, and then root-colored, then simply gone in his shoes. The cloth unripped, but hollow within. His mother burned both foot wraps in the river basin. They floated before igniting. One child lifted his right hand and found his left no longer answered him. He spoke to it in rhyme. When it started moving again, he wept not from relief, but from loss. Still, no fever came, no swelling, no bruising. Only this, strange, seeping limpness. Sideways pupils. The loss of reflex. A quiet coil of defect that moved like a cousin of healing, uninvited but familiar, as if clinging to the back of something that had done good but for too long. The women brought out the elder herbs, those not given by healer's hand but taught instead by soil and mother. Basil chewed bitter, spider vine crushed in glass, ashwater scoured and sealed. But they burned the throat. They did not touch the limb-walk illness. If anything, it worsened. The ones who had once been gentle and alert began to sleep too long. Their flexed fingers stayed so. Their song, when it came, bent sharp and short, as if consonants had twisted backward inside them. Folks no longer asked the healer what she had done. They asked what she had unbound. She answered no one. But she started burning salted sagecloth at dusk in the grove beside the ruins of the south wall. Not the salt pure from her basket, but salt already touched, already laid, taken back. The cloth shriveled and hissed. The fire turned violet twice. It was there, amid elder rot and stone-ground leaves, that they saw her slicing the larger bundles of salt, not into portions, but down its center, splitting it like fruit. The smell drove one woman to her knees. She claimed to have seen a hand inside the salt. Not cast from salt, inside it. Others denied it. But after she said it aloud, they began to cover their salt sets with washed linens. Not for flavor, for sight. When cattle began to twist in the ankle, the people remembered the healer's tongue, how it tasted brine before speaking, and how even infants cured by her hand could sleep through smoke. They saw disease in the way strong men forgot steps they had taken for decades. A smith turned from his forge and missed the floor. A mother lifted her child and stumbled beneath his lesser weight. Hands began to forget their work, lips their shape, and still no one died. The illness was not fatal. It did not die because it had no breath. It crept into uric systems, into balance, into script. The ledgers recorded more tremoring hands among the witnesses. That was not known, not then, but the ink remembered. The clerk wrote the month 3 times wrong and forgot the spelling of his own middle name. He later wrote, "The light has turned inside itself." The healer salted the fire pit beyond her dwelling now, not in a circle, not for ward, but in a spiral, slowly diminishing, the kind that compels the foot to step, and then again and again. One man walked it until gray. When they pulled him from the center, he said only, "It's not hers. She's only cleaning." They buried his shoes separately. The salt poultices had been clear in direction, apply only where the skin breaks honest. But people began daubing them along the skull, the wrist, the temples, where nothing ached, only slowed. The salt turned yellow when placed on veins. Not always, just when the sleep reached behind the eyes. Salt bags sewn into sage were hung across whole archways now. The healer said no word against it, but stray smoke from her binding weeks before tailed into each home that used them, and the sage decided which stayed soft and which turned coarse. One healer's client offered his own salt bag to a neighbor grown stiff in the knees. She died before the full moon. Only her left knee was missing when they laid her out. No blood, no breach, just absence. So they salted the footpath from her door forward and sang none of the burial psalms. Only a hum, a hush, followed not by silence, but by clapping. Once, then not there again. Letters in the altar pages began ending with repetitions. The words, mire, heart salt, light ward. None the priest had written intentionally. His pen could unremember them only for an hour. Then they returned. He sleepwalked into the meadow and walked in a ring. The grass there did not grow again. Rings formed under the beds of the cured. Circular depressions, flat, cold-lined, slick with residue. Some said their pets refused to sleep atop them. One was found trailing leaf mold in summer. One girl, once healed of a mouth affliction thought to be fever-borne, began replying to no questions, only nodding in time to bell tone. When she was asked which bell, she pointed east. The old forge bell had not tolled in decades. They still slept. They still ate. They still breathed. But there was a weighing now, a difference in balance. The salt was still clean when untouched, unburned, but when pressed against the sickened limbs that otherwise knew no hurt, it turned sallow. Some buried it, but it resurfaced by frost. The healer placed no more bowls, but salt walked now, not by spirit, not by superstition, by memory, and the limp beneath their waking grew not heavier, only harder to condemn. Names in St. Bergren had always followed breath. They were spoken beside fields and woven into cloth, packed into bread crusts, and salted meat hung over flames. Names soothe fevers, turn newborns from the cold, and send off the dead with peace. Even the stones in the old wall bore them, chiseled by quiet hands under invocation. Naming was care, but the healer's name never touched the chapel walls. Not in those early seasons when mothers pressed her hand to their sick. Not when women left salt reeds at her door. Not even when the dead walked backward in dream and whispered thanks before dissolving. Her name was never asked. People called her only by what she gave. The salty one, Ash Mother, the one with petals in her wake. It was a young cowherd who first pronounced it aloud. He did not mean to. He had no audience. He was alone by the stone trough near the gully, sitting where no breeze ever lingered, his knees drawn up, his hands raw with brine. The syllables came softly, as if given rather than formed. Not in song, not in prayer, just voice. A breath pressed into shape. Those who passed him later that day said he walked as though waiting, too upright for pain, too slow for health. He began speaking in echoes before sundown, repeating the ends of sentences, his own or others, until even the dog following at his heel lost its rhythm. When the boy's mother asked, "Who taught you that word?" he blinked at her, opened his mouth, and did not speak again. By the week's end, 3 more whispered it. Not her full name. No one ever knew if she had more. But the shape of it, the syllable at the heart, spoken slowly as though learning it from the tongue of a candle. 2 of them forgot how to read the numbers they'd written since childhood. One melted a spoon by accident, warmed only at a meal, no flame in sight. The village did not outlaw the name. They would not shape law for one woman not born of the chapel. But the name hung between shutters, teased the corners of straw beds, hummed just beneath the fevered breath of the recovering. It was a name that made salt smoke, even when left untouched. A name that caught in the throat without pain. A boy said it in the chapel. He was 4. They had taken him to the altar for trembling, first in the hands, then in the feet, then behind the eyes. The priest gave oil. Others gave a dress. And the boy, clear as sunlight between eaves, set it up to the crumbling rafters. Silence followed. The lamp in the niche by Saint Evalda burned dimmer and would not die. The boy did not blink again for 5 days. And when finally he did, he said his own name wrong. The priest that evening convened the elders. They spoke no condemnation, nor judgment, no theology, just silence. And from that silence stood 3 witnesses to a gentle and irreversible decision. The name should be folded, not issued, not instructed, just removed like ash scattered across wind. It would be returned to earth. The next morning, each home that had received healing from her hand bore a sign scratched lightly beneath the outer sill. Not a word, a loop, a breath curled sideways. She did nothing to clean it. The chapel emptied early the following week. The carving that once bore her first drawing, done in clay, then scraped before dry, was found cracked on the northern wall's interior. The crack lined perfectly with the shape of a mouth. Some said it looked like her lips. The vicar stopped speaking during liturgy. He mouthed the sanctity, but gave no sound. His mouth was coated with some bitter stain that hardened by dusk. Easter came with no procession, because the saints still turned, because the ladders rotted before reaching them, because the girl who washed vestments now traced her name only with salt. A traveler passing through, an apothecary from the Hex Road scatter, offered to speak the name, to see what would come. He stood in the hollow, rattled 3 pieces of iron, laid a ribbon of nettle across his breast, and said it in full, with emphasis and breath behind each syllable. When the wind bowed nearby trees in his wake, but not his own body, he said, "That'll do it." His eyes went dry by sundown. The whites turned gray by dawn. He left that morning. No one recalls seeing him pass the east road, but a shoeless track led into the salted field, and did not return. The name continued to hover, unsaid but known. The steeple turned brittle the next rain. Would not rotten, only unwilling. Names stick in places they should not. A smith heard it in the hiss of his steel. A child saw it in the pattern of torn petals beneath her cot. Wherever it echoed, salt bloomed in unnatural shapes. 3-ringed, 9-pointed, and a hush followed. Even the dogs grew quiet around it. And then came the votive bowl in the chapel yard, brought by no one seen, filled with hair, beeswax, and the shape of the name strained through curls. The rain did not touch it. The priest tried to move it. His hand swelled overnight. 3 babies cried at once when it left the step. It was crushed silently the next dawn, not as judgment, as mercy. The village adjusted, slowly. No door said the name. No cup caught it in blessing. No hymn dared rhyme with it. But it passed in other ways. In gesture, in held breath, in the wind curling behind a mother loosening her child's laces, in lullabies that ended with trailing open mouths. When the name stirred unasked, everyone froze, not from fear, not exactly, more from caution and instinct older than them. like pressing fingers to a wound and not lifting them until the blood agrees. And so the name was pressed down, shaped into silence. They gave it no grave, only absence. That winter, 3 trees burst open at their trunks, sap staining the snow in coils. No reason, no flame, just release. And in the stillness between the birds' return and the bells failing again, the air tasted faintly of salt. It was not a trial. No one used that word. The steward never announced it. The priest did not write it in the parish daybook. There was no reading from the book of penance, no herald standing at the green with proclamation. The people of St. Bergrin referred to it only in gestures at first, white cloth tucked into window gaps, wheels bound with twine to stop turning, salt scattered in lines too close to the grain bins to be accidental. But something began to collect in the hollow beside the chapel wall. Wood, dry grass, old tapestries from the barn loft, branches broken from the widow's hedge. That these things required hands to move went unmentioned. It was not hate, they told themselves. Only warding, cauterization. Fire would sweep clean what had been too long unswept. Some still whispered that she had saved more than she had cost. But even saving feels like theft when it grows without thankfulness, and the gratitude refused to come. The ledger had disappeared into strange hands. The bells no longer held their tones. The grain grew in unintended shapes. Children could not be kept from names they could not explain. They did not ask her to kneel. They did not call for her by name. That name, the one shaped only in thought now. She came on her own. They had gathered by 2s and 3s, thinking themselves indistinct, none wishing to be seen as the one to begin. But they were already there, salt laid, fire laid, oaths pressed inward in the silence of breath waiting for reason. And she stepped into it as though the stone had invited her. Without shoes, as always. Her hem dusted not with ash, but wine petal, caught from the field where violet still tried its best. She did not look like a witch. She looked like stillness placed in a woman's frame. The torch had been prepared, but no hand raised it. Not at first. The steward rubbed his thumb along the length of the handle for several minutes, squinting each time breath moved through the grass. The old cowhand who had watched the infants tremble in their sleep offered to take it. The midwife appeared, cloth wrapped tight around her forearms, lips clenched but eyes wide, as though she'd already seen it before. She touched the torch, pressed it into the hands of her old apprentice, and stepped to the edge of the gathered mass. The healer did not move. She smelled of brine and wind, but not of smoke. Her eyes scanned no face. Her breathing was shallow. She seemed not angry, nor afraid, as if waiting for something she already understood. When the torch was finally raised, it guttered once, caught in the twist of air rising from the stone beneath her feet. The flame blinked, refused twice, took the cloth only when a breath not from the torchbearer bent forward into it. She still had said nothing, but someone sobbed. One of the elders, clutching salt at her waist so tightly the cloth burned the skin. Her sob drew one more, then another. The healer climbed 3 steps. There were no steps, only firewood arranged in a precise square around the old stone. But she stepped onto it, as if recalling a stair taught long ago. The torchbearer hesitated. His lip trembled. "I didn't," he began, but the sky answered instead. A wind not of heat bent the trees against their limbs. The torch flicked to the side, then into the base. It kissed the stacked prayer cloths. They took light instantly. Still she stood. Still they watched. Those who once brought her herbs turned their eyes downward. One woman pressed a violet petal into her child's palm and whispered, "Watch the shoulders." Flames danced high against her right hip, then her left. She did not shift. By the time the fire reached past her knees, it was too quiet to be mercy. No screaming came, only crackling soft enough to hear footsteps if one had dared walk away. The priest, standing furthest from the ring, dropped his psalter. The pages did not flutter. The fire bent inward once, tightening around her heart. A single pop issued, not from wood, but from bone or branch or bottle. But no glass had been there. The torch was discarded. The torchbearer sobbed into the sleeve, now blackening with smoke. By the time the fire raged up to crown, something strange unfolded. Ash didn't rise. It fell, like snow, downward. A quiet reversal. The wind reversed direction. Just for breath. Just for reach. And in that ash, symbols settled in the suede of the steward's boot. 3 closures. 1 open. He wiped them away. When the fire died, so softly it didn't pop, only breathed and dimmed, not a soul moved to scatter the coals. There was no body, just salt, gathered in 3 finger-thick lines. Intact. The violet petals found in the coals hours later were unburned, only curled, and in the hollow where her foot had pressed deepest, under the stone, there was discovered, not by intent, but because someone stepped wrong, a flat sheet of something not metal and not fabric. Pale and humming. It was taken. By morning, it was missing. The villagers passed that place gingerly for days. At night, they heard wind that did not match the trees. Naming it fire was dishonest. It had not purged, nor destroyed. Fire consumes with verdict. This fire watched first, as if waiting to be convinced. And when it was not, it simply took her. Or perhaps, received her. Some argued she had never stepped into the flame at all. That she turned. That she left through smoke. That the salt was not a remnant, but a warning. Or an agreement. The priest wrote nothing. Moved through the nave that morning with violet-stung eyes. But he carried no book. And the wall beside the altar sweated a white ring that would not dry. Some touched it. Felt warmth. Others would never go near it. The wind no longer circled when fire was lit in St. Bergren. The smoke went straight upward now, no matter the season, as if nothing dared to stay. The seasons rearranged themselves after the fire. Not the sun overhead, nor the frost in the furrows, but the rhythm beneath it, the measure of illness and decay, of birth and stillness. Things had once followed each other in tidy sequence. Fevers in Lent, coughing in Michaelmas, the wrong-turn births in snow. But no longer. After her burning, the town's breath untimed itself. Hunger arrived not in thunder, but in softness, in too early rains that ate the barley at the root, and fog that kissed infants to sleep and would not lift. Fruit swelled early and rotted on the vine before tongues found them. Scabs went deeper than skin. Grief dulled and repeated. One family forgot their own name, passed it down like a spoon, and then lost the spoon. 3 winters came and went with few words spoken of the fire. They never reassembled the altar, never replaced the cracked tile. 1 petal remained inside the nave, blue turned bone in the cold, preserved entirely. The priest salted it and wrapped it in wax cloth, only to find an identical one returned to the railing every week thereafter. The wax melted, the salt softened, but the petals stayed the same. And then, one morning, just before thaw, a stranger knocked at the steeple door, not the chapel entry, nor the sacristy where sick mothers begged before. The steeple, where rust had eaten the latch. It hadn't opened since the fire. The sound was not thunderous, just soft, consistent, like fingertips repeating a children's rhyme. And when someone finally gathered courage enough to look, they saw only a figure kneeling in the wet hay behind the scatter of old lime tools. Shrouded in red, not blood, but a fabric the color of iron-wept stone. Deep, dulled crimson, like wine pressed long before drinking. The face remained hidden beneath the hood, the hands uncuffed, the robes stitched with uneven thread. The figure swayed long before they moved. They were let in, not from kindness, not even from need, but from instinct too old to name. When the wind won't swing a shutter, you open it by hand, just to keep the air moving. The penitent, as they came to be called, spoke nothing, sounded no bell, and invoked no rite. They offered no name and accepted no tokens, but laid a satchel at their feet and opened it so softly that the hinges made no protest. Inside, bundles of bark, paler than birch, with peeling red flecks, a brass pick carved too precisely for paw or vine, strips of leather char-black with age, yet folded flat and without stiffness. And herbs, many herbs, some known, others unfamiliar. The satchel smelled of damp and blood, but also of salt. Not coarse, not clean, but used and pressed again, vintage salt, if such a thing exists. They made medicine, never with fire, only rubbing, soaking, binding. Their touch was precise, not clinical, not gentle either, like a blade choosing where not to break. Children healed quicker around them. Coughs lasted less. Marrow stiffness uncoiled, but warmth did not return with it. Smiles thinned. Breathing settled too soon. One boy, cured of a deep chest blight, asked his mother why his dreams were all damp now. Another said that faces in the village felt closer. Too close, he muttered. When pressed, he drew a circle with no people in it, and said, "They're waiting there." The penitent shrugged often, though no one knew why. It did not seem like apology, just motion anchoring them to the air. They worked in corners, stables, tool sheds, ruined storehouses. They were never asked to do more, but their satchel never lightened. Once, a cow hemorrhaging from an unseen wound was touched by a bomb mixed in secrecy behind the old carpenter's steps. The cow lived, but refused to face west again. Dogs did not bark at the penitent, but occasionally they followed, not wagging, not sniffing, trailing at a safe length, whining faintly, always stopping at the threshold. Children tied cloth to the staff they carried, braided blue wool, silent pledges, salt pouch whiskers, gifts from hands that did not ask return. One such child pressed her ear beneath the hem of the red cloak and claimed she heard nothing. Not heart, not breath, but the fabric whispered back, ash to ash, in a tone not hers. No adult believed her, yet none removed the thread she tied there. Inside the chapel, dust began to collect in unnatural patterns, fingerprint-shaped but long. On nights moonless enough to make oil lamps quiver, one could walk the back nave and see small circular spots where no dirt clung. They weren't feet. They were absence. The penitent never stepped into the center aisle, nor touched the altar, only passed, tracing the perimeter like a blessing half retracted. The priest aged noticeably that spring. His eyes sweated each time the penitent entered. Not from grief, it seemed, but memory. He offered no confession. Only once did he speak directly. Her hands were not like yours, but close. The penitent stopped then, tilted their head as though catching a shift in wind. No answer came, and from then on, the priest offered no more words, not even in mass. He gestured. He held symbols. His eyes drooped with waiting, but the words did not come back. Not there. Not then. The satchel the penitent carried grew no lighter, though their steps never slipped. Once, when a child brought a wound already healed by her own mother, with time-packed skin and rose vinegar, the penitent removed the poultice, wiped the skin dry, and rubbed a wet thumb over the child's chest. A single drop of dark brine collected at the wound site, then vanished. The child laughed, then grew silent, slept 12 hours the next week, and refused to dream about anyone they knew. The satchel changed that week. A ring was removed from its bottom, iron twisted with twin rivets, one of which had been cracked and sewn shut again with bark fiber. Its surface bore etching, not Latin, but something remembered from the side margins of a page few had dared to scan. The village smith kept it for one night only. The next morning, he said it sang, and he returned it without payment. The penitent never stayed the same place twice. They slept between walls, near burnt stumps, within doorways too narrow for posture. Sometimes, villagers placed cloth beneath them unknowingly. That cloth surfaced days later woven with violet stems at its edge. Always 3, never 4. The well outside the chapel changed when the penitent stood beside it. Once just water, now mirrored. It reflected not the face, but what the face had looked at longest. Children stared inside and gasped. One girl said she saw petals. Another saw a ring of hands. The eldest simply turned, remarked, It doesn't know it's not her. Later that night, petals appeared on her sill, but crushed this time, dry like old paint, hollow as if never wet. Then came the incense smoke from the altar going sideways, straight toward the old road, the one through the field. The milestone, once smeared with soot, cleared itself in the rain that followed. No letters beneath, only score marks, old and rhythmic, not chiseled but dragged. Some say the penitent stood there all night, but no footprints, no trace. When they were gone, they were gone. Only the satchel, found folded at the heelstone of the chapel. Inside, bark, a single sealed tooth, and a violet turned to salt. South of the chapel, where the hills ribbon wet between alder and ash, the field remains barren by all light. Not lifeless, but barren, smooth, wind-stiffened, sealed by intention more than lack. It had once shimmered with flax, then barley, then the brambled shoots with silver crowns the children called Saint's Thistle. But after the fire, after her dust sank into the grain, the villagers salted it. Not scattered, not sprinkled. The whole field laid in pale tracks, cart cask by cart cask, until the soil gave off nothing but the flat odor of ocean forgetting its own motion. They said it was protection. They said it was a border. They called it mercy when spoken aloud. No rut settled there. No birds fed. No one stepped past the third row of stones. But one midnight in late autumn, a woman passing beyond curfew, looking for her dog, though none believed that was the reason, saw them. Herbs where no growth should have taken root. Thin mints and twisted roots-shaped in curls no hoe could have traced. They pulsed faintly, she later claimed. Not glowing, just giving color that did not match the hour. But the color changed when she blinked. When she bent to touch them, they were already retreating, folding into the soil like they had never risen. Only the smell remained. She still has it in the hem of her shawl, she says, though she's boiled it 7 times. Some say she whispered something there. Her words flinched through the air like a sound not ready to be named. The next day, the salt line at the base of the chapel wore thin. The clerk redrew it with a sickle's back edge, turned toward himself. Each household that had received help from the healer once kept a record. Marks etched on root cellar beams, petals pressed inside dead doors, notations scrawled into the undersides of bowls, which herb, which tincture, which season the cure came. Quiet acknowledgments in a ledger too sacred for parchment. Those markings began to curl. The varnish ran. Wood accepted no new scratch. Nails pulled half an inch free of old joists. It was as though the village itself rejected continued proof of her work. When children walked near the field, they were told not to step on the patterned stones. A path of 7 flints set in a crescent along the field's northern edge. No one remembered who first laid them, just that they had been there when the salt came, and that their shapes hardened strangely under sun. One boy placed a hand beside the center flint. His palm stung for 3 days. The pain passed when he laid petals on the parish doorstep. He had never met her. Still, his mouth stopped shaping words for warmth after that. Only names. Never hers. At the center of the field sat the oldest stone. Not taller than a low stool, not wider than a water basin, but very old. Older than chapel. Before roads. Before kindling was traded. It bore no mark, but her breath had touched it. Some say the fire, when it burned her, ran in that direction for the briefest moment, drawn like prayer into a well. They encircled that stone with violet ash the following spring, and the wind refused rain from touching it. Salt placed beneath it dried whiter than elsewhere. Didn't crust, didn't clump, just brightened until it reflected. Some children used it as a looking glass. The ones who did sang differently after. 2 were sent to the northern convent. One left a doll behind whose eyes wept something that wouldn't dry. Faithful came from the boundary towns asking to see the field. They were shown only the edge. The rest turned away by silence. When one pressed forward, holding high a feather blessed in wax, the salt parted for him. But his sandals stuck after 9 steps, and he wept before his knees found ground. returned barefoot, murmuring, she left nothing behind. But the herbs grew still, only at night. Clumps of feverfew drawn in loops that strangled no root. Sage in starburst pattern, black nettle in arches, each gone before the second bird call. No sigil remained by the time the sun slipped behind the iron post laid at the far end of the hedge. They tried to press inked cloth to the ground, record the growths. But the prints smeared mid-drying, and the ink thickened on its own, dragged toward the cloth's corners as if fleeing its own purpose. A woman planted peony near the field's forgotten side. 3 days later, her teeth loosened. She did not cry, only held them in her hand as she walked east. The field doesn't accept shadow now. It folds every reflection, even smoked ducks before crossing it. Only salt veins remain, glowing slightly in certain light, ridges 6 fingers wide, coursing across the soil like the ribs of something waiting to breathe again. And once, those nearing the field heard what should not be heard where no leaves tremble. Footsteps made without feet. They were slow, too slow, but they curved onto the salt, paused, and did not leave. Next frost, a violet burst open at the field's edge. Crude, full, quiet. No wind moved it. No insects marked it. By morning, it was gone. But one neighbor claimed her windows steamed from outside that day. The shutters dripped salt. Her husband wept in his sleep, and he hadn't remembered how before. Some now say the field feeds nothing, but drinks, that she planted healing too deep, that the fire did not burn it out, just pushed it beneath reach. And the herbs know the way back up. Only after dark, only where salt has failed. The priest crosses it once each season, says nothing, leaves a bowl he never watches drain. On warm nights the bowl returns filled with scent not even apothecaries will name. And every time he carries it back inside the chapel, he adds 3 new words to the wall. One beside the cracked tile, one above the doorway, one behind the saints who have long since turned away. So far, no one has turned them back, and no one has told the field to stop growing. The cupboard behind the bread oven had not opened in years. Its hinges hung with fat and soot, turned black from too many winters, and the seam around the frame had thickened with flour where the shapes of children's hands once traced smileless outlines. When the baker's daughter opened it, more from curiosity than cause, the door stuck as if bound by more than damp. Her second tug came with a sound, not splinter, not snap, but something peeling. She said later it was like hearing grief finally breathe. Inside, buried beneath frost-dusted linens and a shallow bowl used long ago for rose salt, lay the second ledger, narrower than the first, not as thick, but far heavier. It was not bound in skin, but in layers of birch bark stretched between braided twine. The twine had rotted at the edges but still held firm at the spine, coated thick with something chalky and bitter, like cured milk laced with niter. Her fingers tingled when they touched it. Her cheek flushed without heat. She brought it to the chapel, placed it on the stone where Saint Evalda had once stood, and backed away. The priest didn't open it right away. The village gathered with something between ache and pause. Some had touched the first ledger, the one locked, then vanished, then said to hide too much. Others had only heard of it. But the shape of this one, short, squat, too tightly wrapped to have come from craft alone, felt different. Younger and older both, as if laid down at the beginning of a wound. He opened it after 3 dusks. No title greeted the page. No name. Just a drawing near the top margin. A hand drawn with a single nail shaded darker than the rest. 5 veins. 3 dotted knots along the palm. Each page bore marks of something added before ink. A light dusting in circle pattern, as if someone had salted the parchment first, then drawn on the firm crust. And the writing, it was not the same hand. Close, sloping the same way, but more precise, more decided. Like the girl who had once learned from watching was now writing from memory she wished she didn't own. The earlier pages bore remedies. Strange, familiar, salt binding wounds dressed in bee oil, poultices laced with ash wine vapor, ice root to quiet the bones. But no measurements were given, just gestures, fragments of breath. The bark, when turned, whispered faintly, not creak, not fold, whispered, as if the paper itself remembered language too. Names weren't listed, but entries were dated by moons. Bodies referenced by shape only. Soft kneeling girl. Infant left in doorlight. Elder lost in laundry steam. Always descriptors, never confessions. One line read, when curing, leave 1 spoon's depth empty behind the breast. Healing sometimes forgets how much to take. Another, boil only once. Ash survives the second time. That entry, short, easy to miss, was circled with oil. Beside it, a drawn ladle. Its stem bore a mark. A loop, then 3 short slashes. One woman recognized it from a binding pouch buried in the north field 10 years before. It had been placed there after the healer saved her husband. Neither had walked the field since. More entries followed. Do not bind in salt alone. Add breath, or risk the memory of touch taking root. Holy water curdles when left near her. Preserve in salt. Bury in warmth. That line came last. Then the pages broke. Blank at first, then fainter, as if another hand had hesitated. Someone had copied, altered, feared. The second handwriting bent thinner, as though the writer doubted the page could carry what it meant to hold. The ink no longer rested, but beaded. Lines smudged. Words collapsed inward. If the salt refuses, wrap the name in beeswax. Bury it near breath. Some villagers began marking their palms again with ash, quiet prayers to fire not to return. One woman emptied vinegar at the church step, though she said nothing as to why. The priest offered 3 pages of the ledger to the bishop's envoy when he passed. The envoy accepted them in silence. 3 days later, the envoy's horse limped. His tongue blackened, and when he returned to the bishop's house, only 1 page remained in the satchel. The other 2 had turned to salt. The one that survived said only, if they name her to punish, take back the breath. If they name her to remember, make room in the bone. After that, the villagers refused to speak near the ledger. One boy tried reading it aloud. He reached the phrase, her hands do not ask, only listen. His jaw clicked, then locked. He hasn't spoken since, but he writes in spirals now. The second ledger was placed in the chapel vault, but it moved. Every week, it returned to a different spot, beneath pews, behind altars, once inside a hearth swept clean. It weighed less each time. Not lighter, but lesser. Like absence collecting. Another drawing surfaced 2 pages shy of the end. A tongue drawn not with lines but small petals, blackened shapes rising from its surface like runes half-scraped. One mother wept openly at the sight of it. Said her infant bore that same shape in her mouth when she was first born, but it vanished the day after they gave her salt to taste. The final pages held no remedies. No ink. Just pressed faint twin circles, repeated 5 times across the binding, as if fingers had held too long. Or 5 tries were made, and only 1 accepted. The night after those pages were shown to the congregation, the chapel weather vane tipped backward in windless dark, and a single voice, uncaught, without body, spoke softly into the nave. Only 2 words were understood. Still here. Not threat, not promise, just presence. The ledger remains. It is no longer called that. Only the second, and each midwinter it opens on its own. Salt collects in a shallow dish nearby, and 1 violet petal folds itself inward, then vanishes, without ever closing. Beneath the trees that do not die, silence breathes with a rhythm no longer counted. The yews have stood for longer than memory, and in St. Bergren, longer than love. They do not bloom, and yet they fruit. They bend only in one direction, even when wind insists otherwise, and the richest soil at their feet has never been tilled, never planted, never even trodden by more than steps too tired for legacy. There is no plaque for what lies under them, no parish stone, no remembered names. But the secret of them rises just before dusk, when light warps like warmed pewter, and the shadows lean forward instead of back. Something moves there. Something still. During spring, when the hills suffer half-flowering, the breath of slipperroot and iron branch barely reaches the yews. But in a still dusk, their scent can be tasted. Damp salt and quiet bark and something threadbare, like old petal between pages. Those who walk near the edge where root meets wild grass often pause. Not for fear, for recognition. The sense that throat remembers something it never learned. They say if you breathe there long enough, your skin begins to taste of ash that hasn't burned yet. One child stepped into the grove last winter, drawn by a humming. A low lilt, not melody, only persistence. Like fabric being rinsed by unseen water. She emerged 3 hours later with salt crusted at the corners of her eyes and wax thread around her finger. She had no memory of song, only of lying still and not needing breath. She sleeps longer now, wakes quietly. 3 men tried pruning the yews twice since. Their tools dulled at contact. The third blade was found the next morning buried tip first in the chapel wall, half a village away. Its handle was wrapped in violet black silk. Someone always leaves offerings under the branches now. Not crosses or relics. Not rosaries. Little things. A child's tooth sealed in balm. Half a stone with a line across it. A bark etching of a woman with no face but 3 lines of salt across her chest. Once a hair. Each strand waxed and lined in parallel. Silken dark, but coarse near the root. And in the tree's deepest crook, a spool was found. Coiled black thread, still knotted, dry but warm to the touch, wrapped in waxed linen, fluttering faintly even when wind did not move the others. No one claimed it, but the thread has returned 3 times, always tied to the lowest branch, like a message to something beneath. Once, the wind passed through the center and sounded different. Not words, not chant, a hum again, but part of it bent upward, almost like breath. The animals refuse the grove. Children, sometimes, forget to. Those who sleep near it on purpose sip from dreams they won't describe, tasting something brackish when they speak by firelight, cheeks cold, hands warmed longer than usual by holding one another. And everyone agrees, now, without debate, without gathering. The grave was never fire. It was the hill. She left by turning inward. They look east more now. They salt their thresholds with quieter hands. The ledger has not been moved again. The salt has not dried again. But the earth is warmer in the grove where the yews take their lilt. Not holy, not unholy, just known, and still correcting silence with presence. Sleep takes slower root in lands that listen, but once it begins to grow, nothing hinders it. Now, in the hush that softens candles long since gone, the stories become more air than tongue, more scent than sentence. The salt has settled. The petals sleep in bundles, tooled beneath frost that no longer bites. The healing was never perfect, the mercy never full, but parts of it remain, threaded in laughter that moves sidelong, carried in root-kissed hours and salt lines rubbed smooth by dusk. Stillness is not the ending. It is the door, left open wide enough for the gentlest breath. The fire no longer speaks. The field calms beneath unfurled sky, and in the softest bends of groves, where trees remember her better than men ever could, the wind begins to hum without rhythm or reason. Only memory, only hush. There's no need to remember everything. Only the warmth of the bowl, the shape of a hand not reaching for anything but rest. Let the yews hold what we forgot. Let the salt keep silent what we never spoke. Let the sleepers dream without the burden of names. And let this night soften onward, beyond candles, beyond pages, beyond fear. Sleep comes now, slow as wax, warm as breath curled beneath wool. Close your eyes. Let the old herbs press toward you with nothing to ask and nothing to take. The healer does not watch, but something gentle remains. That's the end. If what we uncovered deserves to be remembered, leave a word. That's how history survives. Have a good night.